In this video, we're going to have a look at the elections in Canada, and we're going to have an overview of how elections work in Canada. So the first thing is timing. How do we know when an election should be called? And first of all, before we even look into the timing, we have to look at the fact that the Governor General is the person responsible for the formality of calling an election. Which means they make the official statement, they dissolve the House, they make sure that everything is done appropriately. That's the Governor General's job. However, it is the Prime Minister who decides when an election should be called. It's the Prime Minister who goes to the Governor General's house and informs the Governor General that it is time to call an election. So, what are the reasons that we should be looking at for calling an election? And there's four main reasons that you might see for calling an election. The first reason is that the Prime Minister must take into consideration when an election will be best for their party. When is it that the polls will look good enough, or that their popularity as a party is good enough to start an election process? If the government or if the Prime Minister chooses a time when their party's popularity is at a low, that's probably not going to be the best time to run an election. So they're going to look at running an election at a time when most likely they've made a very popular legislation decision, or at least when they haven't made an unpopular legislation decision or haven't done too much that's unpopular. And they'll keep their eyes on the polls. And then the Prime Minister makes a decision as to when that's going to take place. Also, there is a law in place that states that elections must take place at least every 5 years. In fact, that is entrenched in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Generally speaking, in order to avoid going to that maximum 5-year period, most elections are called after a party's been in power for about 4 years. And that's our second reason that elections are called. They must happen every 5 years, which results mostly in every 4 years an election being called. An election can also be called at a time when the government loses an important vote in the House of Commons. And this is what's called a vote of no confidence. It basically means that the confidence of the House of Commons has been lost, meaning that the government has no confidence, or the House of Commons, the 308 members of Parliament, do not have the confidence of the House anymore. So essentially what happens in that case is a vote of no confidence is called, and most likely the Governor General will be informed to dissolve Parliament and to call another election. The last reason that an election might be called is if the governing party gets a new leader. Now, this isn't always the case. It's happened fairly recently in the provincial government, where Dalton McGuinty stepped down and Kathleen Wynne was elected as the new leader of the Liberal Party, and she's held on to her premiership and did not call an election right away. However, for the most part, whenever a new leader becomes Prime Minister, they usually call an election just to ensure that the public agrees with the new leader who's in power. This is basically the main reason that Kim Campbell, our only female Prime Minister, did not remain in Prime Minister for a long period of time. And that was because she was elected as the leader of the Progressive Conservative Party after Brian Mulroney retired, but in the next election that was called, she ended up losing that election to Jean Chrétien. Who can vote? Well, there's basically only two major qualifications to vote nowadays, and those two qualifications are you must be 18 years old and you must be a Canadian citizen. Now, that wasn't always the case, though. I think we often think that that's always been the case because that's what we're used to. But if you see the points above here, only after 1917 did women get the right to vote in Canada. And you'll remember that back in the Elements of Democracy section, it was 1893 when New Zealand gave women the right to vote. And then you can see that we kind of changed that, or we didn't change that fact until 1918. So starting in 1918, men and women aged 21 and over could vote, and it wasn't until 1970 that our current system of elections was fully established, where men and women aged 18 were able to vote. Notice there's a kind of a thing that we have to be careful of here, and that is that you can't vote if you're a chief electoral officer or an assistant, which means basically that you're running the election. They want people who are running the election to be impartial, and therefore those individuals cannot vote. Some more information. You'll notice that all polling stations are wheelchair accessible, or most are. That's pretty important to people who are running the elections. They make sure that they're held in buildings where those buildings are wheelchair accessible, which is most often why you'll see it in a public building like a church or a school or another type of public building. Is most likely where the election will be taking place. There will also be somebody there who can accommodate people who are visually or hearing impaired. There are special ballots printed for people who are visually impaired that are printed in Braille. And the hearing impaired can always have somebody assist them with the vote process. The Canadian Armed Forces are registered to vote, and they are eligible to vote even if they're serving out of the country. Usually what happens there is they request a ballot, and they fill out what's called a special ballot, and that special ballot is sent in, I think it's sent in at least 8 days before the actual election. The same process happens for Canadians that have been living out of the country for less than 5 years and intend to return. A good example of this would be somebody who's going to school overseas. They're maybe going into the United States to go to an Ivy League school or on a scholarship or something like that, or they've gone over to Britain or Europe somewhere to go to school. If that's the case, then they plan on returning to Canada after they're finished, they can vote. And again, it's a similar process to what the Canadian Armed Forces do with the special vote. This is also another law that's on the books. However, it's not a law that applies too much anymore. Every Canadian must have at least 4 hours to vote. It used to be that the vote was held at much more narrow times. So the vote started at like 9 o'clock in the morning, and it only stopped at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And that left most people who were voting, most people who were working, did not have an opportunity to go to vote. They'd have to try and get out on their lunchtime, or they'd have to try and find time sometime during the day in order to go vote. Well, they changed the law to enable everybody, even people who were working, to vote. And what ended up happening is that people would get time off of work in order to vote. So everybody had to have a 4-hour chunk of time where they were able to vote. And most employers would put that chunk of time at the end of the day. So if you ended your day at 4 o'clock, let's say, then you would get off on voting day at noon so that you could make sure that you could vote at 4 o'clock or by 4 o'clock. That's not really relevant anymore because there's so many other options to voting. You can vote in a pre-poll, so you can go to a location 2 weeks before the voting actually happens, or until the actual vote day, and you can vote at a pre-poll. You can also vote by mail, and the polling stations are open much longer nowadays. So you do have more of an opportunity to vote now. So this rule doesn't really apply too much anymore, and you don't see people getting excused as much from work in order to go vote. An election campaign, for a federal election, it has to be at least 36 days. And that's the time of year when we see all the colorful signs adorning all of our lawns and all the public areas of the city or town that you're in. That time frame used to be much longer, but due to transportation improvements and the fact that television and radio and nowadays social media is becoming more popular for candidates, we've reduced that time down to 36 days, and I wouldn't be surprised if you saw them reducing that campaign down even a little bit more in the future, due to the fact that social media and the internet has allowed for people to get their message out much more easily than even radio and television had the opportunity to do before that. Finances. I guess the key thing you need to understand about finances is that a party can raise as much money as they want, but they're limited to the amount of money that they're allowed to spend on an election. And one of the very important functions of Elections Canada is to ensure that political parties aren't spending too much money on their campaign. And one of the main ways they do that is you must keep track of all of your receipts as a candidate for an election. In fact, you can't stand as a candidate for an election unless you have a financial officer. So somebody who is going to be a member of your campaign that is going to run your finances. You're not supposed to run your own finances. It's not part of the process. And you do have to keep track of how much money you spend just to kind of make sure that you're not overspending on your campaign. And that's just to equalize all the different parties and all the different candidates. There are some parties who are larger than others and some parties that have a better way to make money or an easier way to make money than other parties, and therefore we don't want the vote to be affected by how much money a party has. We'd rather be it based on more what the party believes in. And you'll also notice they've done a couple of other things to try and help parties out. Down here, a party who wins or receives at least 15% of the vote gets half of their expenses back. And then there's also some more specific information as far as gaining a certain number of votes, and if you do, then you can get 22% of your expenses back. And that's another reason they don't want the expenses to get too out of hand, because if this ever were to happen, the government doesn't want to spend all that money or pay all that money back to these very rich parties. Debates are another common function of an election. Most elections now include at least one debate among the party leaders. A new rule went into effect fairly recently. I think it was in the 2004 election. And that ruling has now stated that the only people who are invited to participate in a national debate are the leaders of the four parties, or of any of the parties that have seats in the House of Commons. So you must have a seat in the House of Commons. Your party must have a seat in the House of Commons in order for you to be a part of the debate as the party leader. So you'll see here there are four leaders here. Gilles Duceppe of the Bloc Québécois, Paul Martin of the Liberal Party, Stephen Harper of the Conservative Party, and Jack Layton, the former Jack Layton, of the NDP Party. And that was I think that was the 2000 election, and the four members were there as part of a national debate. Even though the Green Party is a fairly popular party, they've only recently got a seat in the House of Commons, so they will now be able to participate in the national debates. Going along with the campaign and the whole idea of a campaign and the debates and that type of thing, obviously one of the big things that candidates have to do is advertise for themselves. And that advertising can fall into two separate categories. One is what we call positive advertising, and that is this idea where you have a poster that expounds the virtues of your candidate. You can see here, vote for your Liberal candidate, the man with experience, W.V. Bill McTaggart. So it doesn't talk about the opposition at all. It doesn't try and put anybody down or say that another party isn't worthy of your vote. But it's just basically saying, vote for us because we have the best candidate. Negative advertising, or what we call smear advertising, has become a more popular type of advertising. And basically, it's this idea that we are making advertisers, or we're making leaders usually, or candidates, look negative. They're pointing out their flaws or pointing out their alleged flaws, because often a lot of negative advertising is not necessarily true. But yeah, so this negative advertising has become a lot more popular in recent years. And then there's just some election vocabulary that you should be aware of. Elector is a Canadian citizen who's 18 years of old, so basically somebody who's eligible to vote is called an elector. They have the National Register of Electors, which just is a list of names that Elections Canada keeps on hand that lists all of the names of people who are eligible to vote. and they use that to produce a voters list, which then goes out to all the different polling stations. In order to inform you of where you're voting, they send out a voter information card by mail, and you may have seen this come into the mail for your parents. And that voter information card tells you where and when you should be voting, where your polling station is, and what date the actual election is on. The poll clerk is the person that sits immediately in the station, and when you come in, they will cross your name off the voters list to indicate that you have voted. And then we call this place that we go the polling station. And then the deputy returning officer has an important job because they're the person that actually gives you the ballot. So they give you the ballot, you go and you vote, and then usually what happens is you give the ballot back to them and they tear a tab off of that ballot. And then they give the ballot back to you, and you put the ballot in the box. They are not allowed to put the ballot in the box. The deputy returning officer must give the ballot to you to make sure that you are the one that puts it in the box. And that's just to ensure security and ensure that there's no fraud going on, and that the deputy returning officer isn't, substituting votes in for somebody else. Ballot is the paper that we use to vote on. We call that a ballot. It looks very similar to this little image up here. The candidates are the individuals that are wishing to be elected. The voting screen looks exactly like this, actually, almost exactly like this, and it's the private area that you go to mark your ballot. And because we are in a democracy, we use private voting, which means you vote without anybody else seeing, and nobody else sees who you vote. And then finally, you would put your vote into the ballot box after the deputy returning officer has torn off the section.